Welcome back, deep divers. Today we're going deep on something that might not sound super exciting at first glance. Corporate fraud.
Yeah, you might think it's all just numbers and spreadsheets, but trust me, it's a lot more interesting than you think.
Way more, right? I mean, we're
Sure.
talking about schemes that have taken down entire companies. We're talking about people losing their life savings. It's wild.
Yeah, and it's way more common than you might think. It's not just something that happens in those big, high-profile cases you see in the news.
Right, right. Like, I bet everyone listening has probably been touched by some form of fraud, whether they realize it or not. Maybe it's a scam email or a dodgy investment scheme or even just a product that wasn't quite what it was advertised to be.
Right. And the thing is, these scams are getting more and more sophisticated, so it's more important than ever to be aware of what's out there.
Absolutely. So before we dive into the nitty-gritty, I think it's important to define what we're actually talking about here. What exactly is corporate fraud? What makes it different from, say, just regular old fraud?
Well, at its core, corporate fraud involves using deception to gain an unfair advantage in a business context. So we're talking about things like manipulating financial statements, insider trading, bribery, and corruption.
Okay, so it's not just about like stealing money.
It can be, but it's broader than that. It's about betraying trust, breaking the rules, and ultimately harming others for personal gain.
I see, I see. So it sounds like this is something that can happen at any level of a company, from the CEO all the way down to entry-level employees.
Exactly. And it can happen in any industry. No company is immune.
So let's get specific. What are some of the most common types of corporate fraud that we see out there? Give us the rundown.
Okay, so one of the most prevalent and arguably most damaging types is financial statement fraud.
Okay, yeah, I've heard of that one. That's like when companies cook the books, right?
Yeah.
To make themselves look more profitable than they actually are.
Precisely. And they use all sorts of tricks to do it, like inflating revenues, hiding expenses, or even creating fake assets.
And why would they do that? What's the motivation?
Well, there are a lot of reasons, unfortunately. Sometimes it's pure greed. Executives want to boost their bonuses or stock options. Other times, it's about pressure to meet earnings expectations from analysts and investors.
Makes sense. But whatever the reason, it seems like this kind of deception can have some pretty serious consequences.
Oh, absolutely. When a company's financial statements are revealed to be fraudulent, it can trigger a loss of investor confidence, which can lead to a drop in stock price and potentially even bankruptcy.
And what about the employees?
Yeah, they can lose their jobs, their pensions, and the ripple effects can be felt throughout the entire economy.
Okay, so financial statement fraud is a big one. What else do we need to be on the lookout for?
Well, another major issue is insider trading.
Okay, so refresh my memory on that one. What exactly is insider trading?
Basically, it's when someone uses confidential, non-public information about a company to buy or sell stock for their own personal gain.
So like if you know a company is about to announce a major merger and you buy a bunch of stock before the news goes public,
Exactly. You're using information that the general public doesn't have access to give yourself an unfair advantage.
that sounds pretty shady. And it has to be illegal, right?
It is, and for good reason. Insider trading undermines the integrity of the financial markets. It creates an uneven playing field, and it erodes investor trust.
Okay, so we've got financial statement fraud and insider trading. What else should we be aware of?
Another big one is bribery and corruption.
Okay, yeah, that one seems pretty self-explanatory. Isn't that just like paying someone off to do something illegal?
It can be, but it can also be more subtle than that. It might involve giving someone a gift or a favor in exchange for preferential treatment.
I see. So like if a company bribes a government official to get a contract.
Exactly. That would be a classic example.
Right. So we've got financial statement fraud, insider trading, bribery, and corruption. And it's already starting to feel like a pretty long list. Is there anything else these companies are up to?
Oh, there's plenty more. But we'll have to save those for the next part of our deep dive.
All right, well, I'm already hooked. In the next part, we'll explore the ripple effects of corporate fraud. We'll look at how these schemes can damage reputations, destroy lives, and even shake the foundations of our economy. Stay tuned.
We've been talking about all these different types of fraud, and I think it's easy to get lost in the specifics of like each scheme you know.
Yeah.
But what really hits home for me is understanding the ripple effects.
Right.
Like, these aren't victimless crimes. The consequences of corporate fraud, they reach far beyond the boardroom.
It's not just numbers on a balance sheet, right?
Hmm.
We're talking about real people's lives being impacted.
Yeah, absolutely. Think about the employees of a company, right, that's caught in a massive accounting fraud scandal. They might show up to work one day and the doors are locked, their jobs are gone,
Well,
their retirement savings are wiped out.
yeah.
And these are people who had nothing to do with the fraud, but they end up bearing the brunt of the consequences.
That's heartbreaking. And what about the investors, right?
Yeah.
I mean, these scandals can really just shatter people's trust in the whole financial system.
Totally. Investors, big and small, they make decisions based on the information they're given.
Uh-huh.
And when that information turns out to be false, it can lead to huge financial losses. It can really shake their confidence and make them hesitant to invest in the future.
Right.
And this can actually impact the broader economy as a whole.
So it's not just about the immediate victims, right? Corporate fraud can create this kind of climate of fear and uncertainty
Yeah.
that makes everybody think twice before taking a risk.
Exactly. And let's not forget about the damage to a company's reputation, right?
Yeah.
Once a company is associated with fraud, it can be incredibly difficult to rebuild trust with customers, partners, and even employees.
Yeah.
I mean, that stain can linger for years,
Right.
impacting their ability to do business, potentially even leading to their demise.
It's a powerful reminder that trust is a fragile thing. And once it's broken, it can be incredibly difficult to repair.
Mhm.
But, let's get back to those captivating cases we touched on earlier. Okay. I'm ready to unpack some of these scandals in more detail.
Sure.
Let's talk about Enron. What can you tell us about that?
Enron is like, a textbook example of how corporate greed and a culture of deception can lead to, catastrophic consequences.
Yeah.
They were masters of manipulation. They used those special purpose entities we
tell me
talked about earlier to hide billions of dollars in debt and inflate their earnings.
Okay.
And for a while, they were considered a Wall Street darling, a shining example of innovation and success.
Right.
But it was all built on a foundation of lies.
And they managed to fool just about everyone, right? I mean, investors, analysts, even regulators. They all seem to be completely in the dark.
Right.
So what finally brought the house of cards crashing down?
It was a combination of factors. A few astute analysts started to notice discrepancies in Enron's financial statements,
Okay.
and they began asking tough questions.
Mm-hmm.
Journalists started digging deeper,
Okay.
uncovering evidence of wrongdoing. And a handful of brave whistleblowers within the company came forward, risked their careers to expose the truth.
So it was really a collective effort that brought Enron down, huh? A combination of scrutiny from the outside
Yeah,
and then courage from within.
exactly. It's a reminder that even the most elaborate schemes can be exposed when people start asking the right questions and are willing to speak truth to power. And the consequences for Enron were swift and severe. The company filed for bankruptcy in 2001,
Wow.
wiped out billions of dollars in shareholder value, and left thousands of employees jobless.
It's a stark reminder that corporate fraud is not a victimless crime.
Mm.
Real people's lives are destroyed when these schemes unravel.
Absolutely. And the Enron scandal had far-reaching consequences beyond the company itself. It shook investor confidence.
Right.
It led to the passage of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which we'll discuss later,
Okay.
and fundamentally changed the way we think about corporate governance and accounting practices.
Speaking of shocking scandals, let's talk about Bernie Madoff. I mean, his Ponzi scheme is almost legendary in its audacity.
Yeah.
How did he manage to pull it off for so long?
Madoff was a master manipulator.
Okay.
He cultivated an image of trustworthiness,
Right.
leveraging his reputation as a successful Wall Street veteran to gain the confidence of investors.
Uh-huh.
He offered them consistent, above-average returns, which seemed almost too good to be true,
Yeah.
and for a while, people believed him.
It's fascinating how people can be blinded by the allure of easy money.
Right.
But what was he actually doing with their investments? There had to be something shady going on behind the scenes.
Oh, absolutely. There was no real investment strategy.
Oh, wow.
He was simply using money from new investors to pay off older ones,
Oh, okay.
creating this illusion of a successful investment fund.
So it was a classic Ponzi scheme.
Right.
Unsustainable and destined to collapse eventually.
It was essentially a house of cards built on a foundation of lies.
So what finally triggered its implosion?
The 2008 financial crisis played a significant role.
Okay.
As the markets plummeted, investors started asking for their money back.
Uh-huh.
Madoff couldn't keep up the charade.
Right.
He didn't have the funds to meet the redemption requests, and the whole scheme came crashing down.
And the scale of the fraud was just mind-blowing.
Oh, yeah. It was estimated that Madoff defrauded investors of over $65 billion,
$65 billion.
making it the largest Ponzi scheme in history.
Wow.
The impact on his victims was devastating. People lost their life savings, charities were forced to shut down, and the ripple effects were felt throughout the financial system.
It's a powerful reminder of the importance of due diligence and skepticism,
Yeah,
especially when it comes to investments that seem too good to be true.
right.
If something sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
That's a good rule of thumb.
Yeah.
But let's shift gears a bit.
Okay.
Talk about a different kind of fraud, one that involves not just deception,
Right.
but also a blatant disregard for the law and the well-being of others.
Okay.
The Volkswagen emissions scandal is a prime example of how a company can prioritize profits over ethical behavior with far-reaching consequences.
This case really caught the world's attention.
Yeah.
I mean, it seemed like such a betrayal of trust. Volkswagen had this reputation for producing like reliable, environmentally friendly cars.
Right, right.
And then it turned out they were cheating on emissions tests.
Yeah.
How could they think they would get away with it?
It's a classic example of corporate arrogance
Yeah.
and a belief that they were above the law. Volkswagen engineers developed software that allowed their diesel cars to detect when they were being tested
Okay.
and then activate emissions controls to make the vehicles appear cleaner than they actually were.
So they were deliberately deceiving regulators and the public,
Yeah,
putting profits ahead of the environment and public health.
exactly.
What were they hoping to gain from this elaborate scheme?
They were trying to corner the market on clean diesel vehicles. If they knew their cars couldn't meet the stringent emissions standards without sacrificing performance, so they decided to cheat.
Wow.
It was a calculated risk, but one that ultimately backfired spectacularly.
And the fallout was pretty significant, right? I mean, they faced massive fines, legal repercussions,
Yeah,
not to mention a serious blow to their reputation.
absolutely. The scandal cost Volkswagen billions of dollars in fines and legal settlements,
Wow.
led to the recall of millions of vehicles, and tarnished their brand image. It also triggered a wave of investigations into other automakers, raising questions about the integrity of the entire industry.
It's a reminder that in the age of social media and instant communication, companies can no longer hide behind a facade of corporate responsibility.
Yeah.
Consumers are demanding transparency and accountability, and they're quick to punish companies that betray their trust.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
The Volkswagen case is a cautionary tale about the importance of ethical behavior and the long-term consequences of corporate fraud. But it also raises important questions about the role of regulators and the need for stronger oversight to prevent this type of deception from happening again.
We've covered a lot of ground in this part of our deep dive.
Yeah.
We've explored the devastating consequences of corporate fraud, from financial ruin to shattered reputations and environmental damage.
Yeah.
We've also seen how these scandals can erode trust in institutions, impact the economy,
Right.
and leave countless victims in their wake. But it's not all doom and gloom, right?
Right.
Okay, so we've spent the last couple parts of our deep dive exploring the dark side of corporate fraud. It's kind of disheartening to see the damage these schemes can inflict, but we don't want to leave our listeners feeling powerless. So in this final part, let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk solutions. What can be done to prevent these scandals from happening in the first place?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And the good news is that there are steps companies and individuals can take to actually make a real difference. It's not about eliminating fraud entirely, that's probably impossible, but it is about creating an environment where it's less likely to occur. And when it does happen, you can detect it and address it quickly.
So it's kind of like a multi-layered approach.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about building a system of checks and balances to make it harder for fraudsters to operate and easier to catch them if they do.
So it's like you're building a fortress around your company's finances.
I like that. A financial fortress. But yeah, you got to start with clear policies and procedures that outline, acceptable behavior, define the consequences for violating those policies.
Okay, so like rules of the road.
Exactly. This includes things like separating duties, so no single individual has complete control over a financial transaction from start to finish. You also want to implement those robust accounting systems that can really track and monitor all that financial activity, making it harder for fraudulent transactions to slip through the cracks.
It's like that old saying, 2 heads are better than 1.
Right. Multiple sets of eyes can really help to catch those mistakes or intentional misdeeds. But even with the best systems in place, you're still relying on people to follow the rules, right? So you got to address that human element, that greed, that unethical behavior that can drive people to commit fraud.
Okay, so how do you do that? How do you change people's behavior?
That's where promoting a culture of ethics and compliance is super important. It starts with the leadership. Executives need to demonstrate a genuine commitment to ethical conduct, not just talk the talk, but actually walk the walk.
Yeah, lead by example, right?
Exactly. Create an environment where employees feel comfortable speaking up if they see something suspicious without fear of retaliation.
That makes me think of whistleblowers. I hear that term a lot, especially when we're talking about fraud.
Hmm.
Can you explain what that means?
Sure. Whistleblowers are individuals who come forward to report wrongdoing within an organization. They can be employees, customers, even outside observers. Whistleblowers are super important because they often provide that first line of defense against fraud. They shine a light on activities that might otherwise go undetected, allowing companies to address the problem before it blows up.
But whistleblowing can be risky, right? I mean, imagine having to speak out against your own employer. It must be scary.
You're absolutely right. It takes a lot of courage to come forward. That's why it's so important for companies to have strong whistleblower protection policies in place. These policies should guarantee confidentiality, protect whistleblowers from retaliation, and have those clear channels for reporting concerns without fear of reprisal.
So basically creating a safe space for people to speak up, knowing they'll be protected.
Exactly. But even with all these internal measures in place, sometimes you need an outside perspective. That's where regulators and auditors come in. They provide that objective assessment of a company's financial statements and their internal controls.
Okay, so like independent watchdogs.
That's a great way to put it. Auditors can help identify weaknesses in a company's systems, flag potential areas of risk, and offer recommendations for improvement. And regulators, well, they play a huge role in setting industry standards, enforcing those regulations, and holding companies accountable for their actions.
Sounds like it takes a whole village, right?
Yep.
A combination of internal and external forces working together.
Exactly. And these days, technology is playing an increasingly important role in fraud detection and prevention as well.
Oh yeah, that makes sense.
Companies are using data analytics, artificial intelligence, things like that, to analyze tons of data. And these systems can spot those patterns and anomalies that could indicate fraudulent activity.
So they can catch those fraudsters in the act, basically.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Technology can help spot red flags that human analysts might miss, giving companies a chance to investigate and address those issues early on.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of different strategies for combating corporate fraud. We talked about internal controls, ethical leadership, whistleblower protection, regulatory oversight, and cutting-edge technology. Whew, that's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot to process.
But for our listeners out there who are maybe feeling a little overwhelmed, what's the one key takeaway here?
Well, the key takeaway is, while we can't eliminate fraud entirely, there are things individuals can do to minimize their risk. Be an informed investor or consumer. Do your research, read financial statements, look at independent reviews, and be wary of promises that seem too good to be true. And if something feels off, trust your gut. Ask questions.
Like we always say,
Yeah.
if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been a fascinating and sometimes a little unsettling journey into the world of corporate fraud. But I think we all come away with a better understanding of the different forms it can take, the devastating consequences it can have, and most importantly, the steps we can take to combat it.
Well said. Corporate fraud is a complex issue, but by understanding the risks, staying informed, and advocating for greater transparency and accountability, we can all help create a more ethical and sustainable business environment.
That's a great point. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And to our listeners, remember, knowledge is power. Stay curious, stay vigilant, and keep diving deep.